The woman known to history as Golda Meir was born Golda Mabovich on the 3rd of May 1898 in Kiev, the capital of Ukraine, then part of the Russian Empire. Her father was Moshe Mabovich. He was the son of a soldier in the Russian army who studied at a prestigious religious school in Slonim in western Belarus, but eventually trained as a carpenter. Her mother was Blum Nidich, and the couple would have 8 children, of whom 3 daughters survived into adulthood. The eldest surviving daughter, Shana, was born in 1889. Golda was born 9 years later in 1898, and the youngest daughter, Zibka, also known as Clara, was born in 1902. They were born into a Jewish family and were brought up in Pinsk in modern-day Belarus, part of the Payalov settlement on the Russian Empire's western frontier, which the Jewish population had been confined to since the late 18th century. Soon after Golda's birth, her paternal grandmother, Zipi, arrived in Kiev to take charge of the household, causing conflict with her mother Blum concerning the upbringing of the children. Golda later recalled that her earliest memories included witnessing arguments between her mother and grandmother. After the birth of her younger sister, Zipka, in 1902, Golda's upbringing was entrusted to her 12-year-old sister, Shana. She had an unhappy childhood, growing up in poverty and surrounded by the bickering women of 3 different generations: her grandmother, mother, and elder sister. In early 1903, Moshe Mabovich moved the family back to Pinsk, where Golda lived with her Nidich grandparents. The spring of 1903 witnessed a new wave of political violence against Jews, sparked off by an anti-Jewish riot or pogrom in Kishinev, the capital of present-day Moldova, in April 1903. A few weeks later, in response to rumors of an imminent pogrom in Pinsk, Moshe made preparations by barricading the door with wooden planks, while the teenage Shana took a kitchen knife for self-defense. Golda and her baby sister Zibke were taken upstairs and looked after by neighbors. Although the pogrom never materialized, the fear and trepidation experienced by the 5-year-old Golda during the ordeal remained with her for the rest of her life. Not long afterwards, Moshe made the fateful decision to join tens of thousands of fellow Russian Jews in emigrating to the United States. As was the custom at the time, he would leave alone, find a job, and save up money to bring the rest of his family across the ocean. While the family awaited word from Moshe, Shana joined a group of politically active high school students who discussed what the Jews could do to end the anti-Semitic discrimination they were facing. A tiny minority of Jews were drawn towards Zionism, the ideology championed by the journalist Theodor Herzl from Vienna, who called for the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine, then ruled by the Islamic Ottoman Empire, which governed Turkey and the Middle East from its capital in Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul. Following the Kishinev pogrom, Herzl wrote to the British colonial secretary Joseph Chamberlain about the creation of a temporary Jewish state in Uganda, but the proposal was not taken forward. In the meantime, many Jews were drawn to socialist and Marxist doctrines which aimed to unite the working class and overthrow the Russian monarchy under Tsar Nicholas II, creating a new state free of prejudice and discrimination. Although there was a mutual antagonism between the working classes and the Jews due to the role of Jewish bankers, many socialist leaders were Jews. Shana and her group were supporters of both Zionism and socialism and had a great influence on Golda's political upbringing. Although Blum was concerned about Shana's political activities and feared that the family might be targeted by the Tsarist state, the teenager defied her mother and continued to attend political meetings. Shayna was also responsible for teaching her sister to read and write, alongside basic arithmetic. When Herzl died in 1904 at the age of 44, Shayna wore black in mourning for over 2 years. In the meantime, after first arriving in New York, Moshe Mabovich moved to Milwaukee in the state of Wisconsin, where he adopted the name Morris and found a job working on the railroad. By 1906, he was in a position to send for his wife and daughters. Traveling with forged documents, Golda accompanied her mother and sisters out of Russia initially to Vienna, before taking a train to Antwerp in Belgium and boarding a steamer across the Atlantic. After arriving in Quebec 2 weeks later, the family continued by train until they arrived in Milwaukee in June 1906. 8-year-old Golda Mabovich was not unhappy to leave Eastern Europe behind and would have much fonder memories of the United States, where she would spend the next 15 years of her life. Within days of arriving in Milwaukee, Bloom decided to open a grocery store assisted by Shayna while the 2 younger daughters went to school. Between 1906 and 1912, Golda attended the 4th Street School, now known as the Golda Meir School after its most famous alumna. While Golda was happy enough to be among Milwaukee's Jewish community without the risk of being targeted by pogroms, Shayna resented having to work with her mother and briefly escaped to Chicago to work at a clothing factory. By contrast, Golda was enjoying her studies and soon came to be top of her class. She was also gaining recognition outside the classroom, and in 1909, at the age of 11, she and her best friend Regina Hamburger set up the American Young Sisters Society to raise money to buy textbooks for their poorer classmates. As the only fluent English speaker in her family, she helped recently arrived Jewish immigrants find jobs and encouraged them to join labor unions. The Mabovich home hosted meetings of the local branch of Poale Zion, or the Workers of Zion, a labor Zionist organization that combined Zionist and socialist ideas. As her father and her sister were both members, in 1912, the 14-year-old Golda joined the organization in her own right. Although Golda graduated as a valedictorian from her elementary school in 1912, her conservative parents wanted her to stay at home and await marriage to a successful man. Encouraged by her sister, Golda insisted on continuing her education and enrolled in North Division High School in the autumn. By this time, Shayna had moved to Denver to recover from a bout of tuberculosis, following which she married Shammai Korngold, an old acquaintance from Pinsk. Within months of Golda starting high school, Bloom informed her that she had found her the perfect husband, a 30-year-old man named Mr. Goodstein, who worked in real estate. Horrified at the idea of marrying a man twice her age, a desperate Golda wrote to the Korngolds, who responded by inviting her to stay with them in Denver. With assistance from her friend Regina, Golda escaped from her parents' house in February 1913 and took the train to Denver. She enrolled in the Northside High School and spent her evenings discussing politics at the Korngolds' house with the local Jewish community. Shayna criticized Golda for being too friendly with the men at the social gatherings and encouraged her to concentrate on her studies. Golda refused, increasing tensions between the two sisters until one day in 1914, when Golda decided to move out of the Korngolds' house, renting a small apartment while working in a department store. At around this time, she began dating Morris Meyerson, a 21-year-old sign painter and socialist activist who sparked her interest in music and poetry. The following year, Golda's parents wrote to her, asking her to come back home to resume her education. She agreed to do so and returned to North Division and graduated in 1916, while Morris remained in Denver, writing her several letters a week. In Milwaukee, Golda maintained a close interest in European affairs during the First World War. The fighting between the Russian Empire and the Central Powers of Germany and Austria-Hungary on the Eastern Front displaced millions of Jews from the Pale, and Golda joined her father in raising funds to support Jewish refugees. She joined the executive committee of her local Poale Zion branch, strengthening her belief in Zionism and fueling a desire to move to Palestine. By 1916, Golda was reunited with Meyerson, who had moved to Milwaukee to join her. He did not share Golda's enthusiasm about Palestine and hoped to build a life in America. After Golda issued an ultimatum to Morris, refusing to marry him until he agreed to move to Palestine with her, he eventually gave in, and the couple were married on the 24th of December 1917. After Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in January 1917, prompting the United States to join Britain, France, and a collapsing Russia in the First World War, transatlantic shipping was cancelled, and the newly married couple was unable to travel to Palestine. Golda was optimistic about the Zionist cause after British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour's declaration of November 1917 announced British support for the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine that protected the rights of the non-Jewish population in the region. While Golda had a job in the local library, she spent most of her time doing political work for Poale Zion. After the end of the First World War in November 1918, the American Jewish Congress was established to determine a united American Jewish position in advance of the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. Golda was elected to the body and joined her fellow Zionists in demanding that Palestine should be given to Britain as a mandate under the newly created League of Nations to implement the Balfour Declaration. After the meeting of the Congress, Golda was invited by the National Poale Zion organization to go on a fundraising tour across the country. Against the wishes of her husband, her parents, and her sister Shana, she enthusiastically accepted and only returned to Milwaukee on occasion. As the Zionists had hoped, Britain was granted the mandate for Palestine, and in the summer of 1921, Golda and Morris were finally able to make the journey. They were part of a group of 17 Jewish pioneers, including Shana and Shammai Korngold and their 2 children, as well as Golda's childhood friend Regina Hamburger. On the 14th of July 1921, they arrived in Tel Aviv, the Jewish settlement founded in 1909 near the port of Jaffa. In contrast to the picture of Palestine Golda had painted for her American audiences, Tel Aviv was a ramshackle little town in the desert. Morris soon found a job as a bookkeeper in the ancient city of Lod, 10 miles away, while Golda began teaching English. Golda aspired to join a kibbutz, a Jewish collective farm, and applied to the kibbutz Moravia in the Jezreel Valley to the north. The Meyerson's application was rejected twice by the kibbutz members, but Golda's determination won them admission for a trial period on a 3rd vote. Golda was determined to show her fellow kibbutzniks that she was as capable of agricultural work as anyone else, and eagerly joined the communal dinners, while Morris preferred to be alone with his gramophone. Nevertheless, both were admitted to the kibbutz on a permanent basis. At the end of 1921, Golda represented Moravia at the meeting of the kibbutz movement, where she was surrounded by influential politicians including David Ben-Gurion, Secretary General of the Histadrut, the General Federation of Labor, and leader of the Workers' Party, Adat HaAvoda, or Unity of Labor. Other influential figures included Berl Katznelson, the intellectual founder of the labor Zionist movement, and Levi Eshkol, head of Degania Bet Kibbutz. During her address to the conference, Golda was criticized for speaking in her native Yiddish tongue rather than in Hebrew. After returning to Mohavia, she discovered that her husband, Morris, was depressed and suffering from malaria. Nevertheless, she remained committed to her political duties and was soon elected to represent her kibbutz at the Women Workers' Council. As a representative of the council at the Second Histadrut Conference in 1923, Golda argued that there was no need for a separate women's council if women could be part of the Histadrut leadership, a suggestion which brought her to the attention of Ben-Gurion and Katznelson. By 1924, Morris refused to continue living in the kibbutz, and the couple moved to Tel Aviv and later Jerusalem. While Morris was enchanted by Jerusalem's history and culture, Golda preferred to maintain her connections to the Zionist political center in Tel Aviv. On the 23rd of November 1924, Golda gave birth to a son named Menachem after her maternal grandfather. The couple worked for Solel B'nai, the building cooperative attached to the Histadrut, but the organization was experiencing financial difficulties and paid salaries in vouchers which were not accepted in most shops. In 1925, a frustrated Golda returned briefly to Mohavia, taking 6-month-old Menachem with her. But rather than allowing her to work on the farm, the kibbutz members asked her to be the nanny, causing her to return to Jerusalem. After the birth of her daughter, Sarah, in May 1926, Golda swallowed her pride and taught English at a private school. The same year, Golda's parents moved to Palestine and built a home in Herzliya, to the north of Tel Aviv. Despite frequent trips to visit her parents and her sister, Golda remained unhappy and grew distant from her husband. She was rumored to be romantically involved with other men, including David Remez, the head of Solel B'nai and a protege of Berl Katznelson. In 1927, Remez offered her the position of Secretary General of the Women's Worker Council in an attempt to strengthen Histadrut's control over the organization. Golda was happy to accept the role and moved back to Tel Aviv with her 2 children, leaving her husband behind in Jerusalem. Leaving the children in the care of the kindergarten and babysitters, Golda used her position at the Women's Council to participate in the debates at the Histadrut. The organization served as the vehicle for the creation of the new Jewish state, and Golda was soon asked to return to the United States on fundraising tours promoting Jewish immigration to Palestine. Her American upbringing ensured that she received a popular welcome, and her efforts were recognized by the Histadrut leadership, which also sent her to Western Europe to win the support of socialist organizations in Britain and France. Back in Palestine, Golda witnessed the founding of Mapai, the Workers' Party of the Land of Israel, after the merger of the 2 main socialist parties in the country. In 1932, Golda went to the United States to seek treatment for her daughter's kidney illness and to revitalize the labor Zionist movement. For the next 2 years, Golda traveled throughout North America, promoting the Zionist cause, describing the exploits of the pioneers who emigrated to Palestine in biblical terms. Her packed schedule allowed her little time to spend with her children, who resented her lengthy absences. When Golda returned to Palestine in 1934, she was appointed to Histadrut's Executive Council, where she was placed in charge of tourism. Although Ben-Gurion had made significant progress in attracting Jewish settlers and Tel Aviv's population had increased to 150,000, the waves of Jewish immigration provoked riots from the existing majority Arab population. In response to the demonstrations, the British authorities in Palestine sought to limit the number of Jews resettling in Palestine by setting quotas, which were inevitably regarded as too high by the Arabs and too low by the Jews. At the same time, Palestine was receiving a steady stream of Jewish immigrants from Germany after Adolf Hitler's anti-Semitic Nazi Party came to power in 1933. While she continued to travel abroad as Histadrut's international representative, part of Golda's work during this period included providing these immigrants with accommodation and jobs as directed by the Jewish Agency, the organization which served as the de facto Jewish government in Palestine. When a new wave of political violence broke out between Arabs and Jews in 1936, the British government dispatched Lord William Peel to chair a commission of inquiry to devise a solution to the Palestine question. After meeting with Arab and Jewish leaders, the Peel Commission decided the best solution was to partition Palestine, establishing a newly independent Jewish state while annexing the majority of the country to the Arab kingdom of Transjordan to the east. While Ben-Gurion was delighted about the prospect of an independent Jewish state, Golda bitterly rejected the Peel Commission's recommendations for partition, which allocated to the Jews only a quarter of historical Palestine. At the 20th Zionist Congress, held in Zurich in Switzerland in 1937, Golda marshalled opposition to the Peel Commission's proposals by bringing together right-wing Zionists who were unwilling to make any concessions to the Arabs and Jewish socialists who supported a united Palestine with Arabs and Jews living side by side. The Congress endorsed Golda's position, and a second British commission, which reported in 1938, rejected partition. In the meantime, the situation for European Jews worsened after Hitler's annexation of Austria and after the threats to incorporate Czechoslovakia into the Nazis' Third Reich in 1938. Golda pleaded with British officials to increase the immigration quota, which had been cut to just over 10,000 in 1937, while at the same time serving as an operative of the Mossad Lialiyabet, a secret network that smuggled Jews out of Nazi-occupied Europe. In the summer of 1938, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt called the Evian Conference, bringing together representatives of 32 nations to discuss the situation faced by European Jews. As an observer representing the Jews of Palestine, Golda was angered by the repeated expressions of sympathy for the Jews combined with the refusal to accept a significant number of refugees. In May 1939, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain published a final plan for Palestine which confined the Jewish population to 5% of Palestinian territory and restricted Jewish migration to 75,000 over the next 5 years. An independent Palestinian state would be established within 10 years, jointly governed by the Arabs and the Jews. The Jews in Palestine felt betrayed, and Golda joined Ben-Gurion and Katznelson in leading almost 200,000 Jews in a general strike. At the same time, the Jewish community in Palestine prepared to wage war against both the British and Arabs by establishing Jewish settlements throughout the country. While these plans were being finalized at the 21st Zionist Congress in Vienna in August 1939, a non-aggression pact was signed between representatives of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, the communist state which governed much of the former Russian Empire. On the 1st of September, Hitler invaded Poland, a country of 4 million Jews, leading to the outbreak of the Second World War after Britain and France declared war on Germany. Golda and her colleagues found themselves in the awkward position of encouraging Jews to join the British Army against a possible German invasion while illegally smuggling Jewish refugees into Palestine. As one of the senior leaders of the Jewish community, she served on the British War Economic Advisory Council to help enforce wartime rationing measures among the Jewish population, while also serving as head of Histadrut's political department with responsibility for resolving labour disputes. While the British attempted to crack down on Jewish immigration into Palestine, Hitler's armies were rolling through Europe, forcing the surrender of France in 1940 and launching the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, occupying large parts of Belarus and Ukraine. In the summer of 1942, German and Italian forces in North Africa threatened to strike Egypt and Palestine. When rumours reached Palestine in 1942 that the Germans were sending Polish Jews to concentration camps and exterminating them in gas ovens, Golda was one of the few Jewish leaders who believed them. She attempted to raise funds to provide Jews under Nazi occupation to fight back, and after the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943, she offered the services of the Haganah, the Zionist paramilitary organization, to support British secret agents behind enemy lines. Following General Bernard Montgomery's defeat of German and Italian forces at the Second Battle of El Alamein in the autumn of 1942, Palestine was no longer at risk of German invasion, but the war in Europe continued until the Nazi surrender in May 1945. When the Allied armies liberated over 600,000 Jews from concentration camps across Europe, Golda and her colleagues sought to find a new home for them in Palestine. The Zionists were encouraged by the British Labour Party's election victory in July 1945, bringing to power a party that had consistently supported a Jewish state in Palestine. When Prime Minister Clement Attlee and Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin sought to retain their conservative predecessor's policy in Palestine, the Jews felt betrayed once again. To Golda's dismay, the Haganah had joined two right-wing guerrilla groups in the Jewish resistance movement, but after Bevin had announced his policy, Golda endorsed violent resistance, sparking a civil war between Jewish fighters and British authorities. The United States government was far more sympathetic to the Zionists, and following American intervention, the British agreed to establish an Anglo-American commission which met in early 1946. On the 25th of March 1946, Golda addressed the commission, describing the persecution and terror the Jews had faced in Europe even before Hitler's rise to power, and argued that the only solution for the senselessness of Jewish life and Jewish death lay in creating an independent Jewish life in a Jewish homeland. On the 1st of May, the Commission recommended the continuation of the British mandate in Palestine, while calling for the British to approve 100,000 visas for Jews. When the British government refused to grant the visas, the conflict on the ground in Palestine intensified. After a British crackdown on the leadership of the Jewish Agency, Golda became head of the organization's political department in June 1946. While she struggled to reconcile her revulsion to terrorist activity and her determination to resist the British presence in Palestine, in February 1947 the Attlee government changed course and referred the Palestinian question to the United Nations. In September, the United Nations Special Committee on Palestine proposed partition with the city of Jerusalem under international jurisdiction. Under the proposals, the Arabs would receive a 43% share of the Palestinian land, with the Jews obtaining 56%, a large part of which included the uninhabited Negev desert. While the Zionists were happy to accept these proposals, most of Palestine's Arab neighbors rejected the UN plan, with the exception of King Abdullah of Transjordan, who aspired to the leadership of the Arab world and was prepared to support a Jewish state in return for Jewish support of Jordanian annexation of Arab Palestine. When the Jordanian king proposed secret negotiations with the Palestinian Jews in November 1947, he was surprised that the Jews had sent a female envoy in the form of Golda Meirson. While Abdullah hoped to annex the whole of Palestine before carving out an autonomous Jewish state, Golda was pleased to hear that he had no desire to join his fellow Arab leaders in resisting a Jewish state by military force. When the UN General Assembly met at the end of November, Golda held the fort in Palestine while her colleagues were in New York, and on the 29th of November, the General Assembly passed a resolution endorsing the partition plan with 33 votes in favor, 13 against, and 10 abstentions. While the Palestinian Jews cheered their victory, Arab guerrilla fighters began to attack Jewish settlements. Golda was placed in charge of the defense of the city of Jerusalem and exposed herself to danger by frequently going to and from Tel Aviv, crossing through territory occupied by hostile Arabs. In January 1948, Golda once again returned to the United States to lead a fundraising campaign to acquire weapons for the Haganah. Referencing the 6 million Jews killed by the Nazis during the Holocaust, she persuaded wealthy Jewish businessmen to contribute to the cause, raising $15 million by the beginning of February. By the time she returned to Jerusalem in March, she had raised over $50 million, allowing the Haganah to continue its resistance and enabling Ben-Gurion to order a counteroffensive in April that broke the siege of Jerusalem. While Golda was disappointed that she was not appointed to the new Jewish National Administration, formed in March, on the 10th of May, she met King Abdullah for the second time, this time in his capital of Amman. While the king still seemed keen to stay out of the war, Golda was frustrated by his suggestion that the Jews should wait a few years before full independence. On the 14th of May 1948, in anticipation of the expiry of the British Mandate the following day, David Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel in Tel Aviv. The 37 members of the Israeli Parliament, the National Council, attached their signatures to the Declaration of Independence. Among the names was Golda Meirson, who had recently celebrated her 50th birthday. She had been in Palestine for 27 years, during which time she had gradually climbed the ranks within Jewish political organizations to become one of its leaders and a close ally of Ben-Gurion's. Although she was not formally a member of Ben-Gurion's cabinet, she nevertheless attended meetings and made her voice heard. Soon after the declaration of Israeli statehood, she returned to the United States and raised another $75 million for the cause. Despite being hospitalized in a car crash in New York, Golda was then asked to travel to Moscow as Israel's ambassador to the Soviet Union. While the Soviet Union and the United States had been allies against Germany in the Second World War, by the late 1940s the wartime alliance had collapsed, making way for the Cold War, an ideological struggle between Soviet communism and American capitalism for global influence. The Soviets supported Israeli statehood and provided arms to the Israeli Defense Forces, the official successor to the Haganah. After presenting her credentials in September 1948, Golda initiated talks with the Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov about trade and economic aid to Israel, but the Soviet economy had been shattered during the war, and the Soviets were unwilling to make any major commitments. Furthermore, Soviet support for Israeli statehood was motivated primarily by a desire to expel the British from the Middle East, and Stalin believed that Israel would be an American satellite. While she struggled to make progress in Moscow, Golda regretted being away from home, where the Israeli military had taken control of Galilee in the north and driven the Egyptians out of the Negev desert in the south. It only remained for the Arabs to admit defeat. In Moscow, Golda considered it her duty to reach out to the 3 million Jews in the Soviet Union, many of whom wished to emigrate to Israel. She struggled to do so until Molotov's Jewish wife, Polina Zemchuzina, advised her to go to Moscow's synagogue. While Zemchuzina would soon be arrested and exiled to Kazakhstan, in January 1949, Golda went to the synagogue to mark Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, where tens of thousands of Jews acclaimed her in a demonstration of support for Israel. Within weeks, Stalin began to crack down on the Jews, and in February, Golda was recalled to Israel to serve as Minister for Labor. In March, Golda returned to Israel to take up her position at the Ministry of Labor, where she was responsible for providing homes and jobs to the hundreds of thousands of Jews arriving in Israel. In the Knesset, the new parliament, she announced plans to build 30,000 new houses, promising to raise the money in the United States. Despite being asked for funds for the Israeli military and for social welfare, the American Jews agreed to finance the construction project by buying bonds backed by the Israeli government. When she returned to Israel, she proposed an ambitious infrastructure construction project to tackle the unemployment problem, which included the repair of roads damaged during the recent war. In 1950, she returned to America, seeking $15 billion over the next 15 years via government bonds. Back at home, she continued to encourage Jewish immigration into Israel despite the pressure on the existing state infrastructure. While she labored to develop the Israeli economy, in May 1951, Golda received news that her husband, Morris, had died of a heart attack. Weeks later, her political mentor and close confidant, David Remez, was also dead. Casting aside these personal tragedies, Golda worked 19 hours a day to build a social democratic state in Israel. In January 1952, she proposed a national insurance program to provide financial support for women, children, and the elderly. Despite resistance from the finance minister Levi Eshkol, the Minister of Labor prevailed. In 1953, she successfully passed a bill introducing national service for women in hospitals and schools, but not without angering the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. In 1955, when Golda was asked by Ben-Gurion to run as Mapai's candidate for mayor of Tel Aviv, she lost out after 2 conservative Orthodox representatives voted in favor of the incumbent. Although a United Nations brokered ceasefire had been in place since July 1949, Arab insurgents, or Fedayeen, continued to launch attacks into Israeli territory. Frustrated by the constant incursions, in October 1953, Moshe Dayan, the belligerent chief of operations of the Israeli Defense Forces, sent a force of crack troops commanded by Ariel Sharon to launch a retaliatory attack on the Fedayeen base at Kibbutz in Jordan, killing 69 civilians. The incident sparked a series of disagreements between Ben-Gurion and his foreign minister Moshe Sheret, who deplored the disproportionate use of force employed by the Israeli Defense Forces. During the power struggle, Ben-Gurion resigned from the premiership in January 1954 and was replaced by Sheret. But by late 1955, he was back in the top job and sought to consolidate his authority. In June 1956, shortly after adopting the Hebrew surname Meir, Golda replaced Sharet at the Foreign Ministry, serving as Israel's representative on the international stage. In July 1956, Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal, threatening British and French economic interests. When the British and French invited Israel to join a plot to seize the canal by military force, Ben-Gurion jumped on board, resenting Nasser for closing the canal to Israeli shipping and allowing Palestinian Fedayeen to launch attacks on Israel from Egyptian soil. While Meir was party to the discussions, Moshe Dayan and Shimon Peres from the Ministry of Defense did much of the talking. The three parties developed a plan for Israel to launch an invasion of Egypt, while Britain and France would intervene under the pretext of acting as peacekeepers while accomplishing their true intentions of occupying the canal. The operation began on the 29th of October 1956, and within 4 days, Israeli troops captured the Gaza Strip and the entire Sinai Peninsula to the east of the canal. Though badly beaten, Nasser rendered the canal unnavigable by sinking ships and gained international sympathy, while both the Soviets and the Americans urged Israeli forces to withdraw at the United Nations. Foreign Minister Golda Meir represented Israel at the UN, arguing that the Israeli occupation of the Sinai Peninsula was an act of self-defense after the Fedayeen repeatedly attacked Israel from Egyptian bases. Succumbing to diplomatic pressure from the United States, Ben-Gurion agreed to withdraw from the Sinai in return for US recognition of Israel's right to retaliate against further Fedayeen attacks from Egypt. Meir reluctantly gave a speech to the UN to this effect, but was disappointed when the Americans did not acknowledge Israel's right to retaliate. In the aftermath of the Suez Crisis, Meir and Ben-Gurion also had their differences about how to deal with West Germany. While Ben-Gurion sought economic and military support from the Germans, Meir was hesitant about engaging a government which retained many former Nazi officials. Over time, as Germany became Israel's second-largest arms supplier, Meir supported Ben-Gurion's policy of seeking closer ties to Germany to the extent that in 1965 she accepted the appointment of former Nazi officer Ralph Friedman Pauls as German ambassador to Israel. In May 1960, Israel's National Security Agency, Mossad, abducted the senior Nazi official Adolf Eichmann from Argentina, where he had fled in 1945 after being found guilty of war crimes. When Argentina complained to the UN that Israel had violated its sovereignty, Meir issued a strong defense of Israeli actions, arguing that the illegal incursion was justified in order to bring perpetrators of the Holocaust to justice. The UN endorsed her argument, and Eichmann was tried and executed in Israel in June 1962. Meir spent much of her tenure as foreign minister developing relations with newly independent states in sub-Saharan Africa. While Meir saw black Africans as natural allies in the struggle against colonialism and ethnic discrimination, the African states were glad for the opportunity to receive economic assistance from a country that had not been involved in carving up the continent. Meir helped President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana establish a state shipping company. Israeli construction companies managed a public works program in Nigeria, and after the Belgians left the Congo in 1962, she provided Israeli army doctors to address the shortage of physicians. While Ben-Gurion was skeptical of his foreign minister's outreach in Africa, Meir justified her efforts as a means to counter Arab influence in the region. Meir's interest in Africa was also prompted by a sense that Ben-Gurion saw diplomacy primarily as a means to acquire weapons and relied on officials in the defense ministry, which he ran himself, to guide his relations with the world's leading powers. Not only did Meir consider the likes of Dayan and Peres needlessly belligerent, she feared that they would turn away from the dominant Labour Zionist ideology. When Ben-Gurion attempted to elevate Dayan and Peres to the cabinet in the late 1950s, Meir resisted alongside two veteran Mapai leaders, Minister of Education Zalman Aran and Minister of Trade Finis Sapir. A long and tortuous struggle ensued between Ben-Gurion and the Old Guard, led by Meir, during the first half of the 1960s. Ben-Gurion sought to open a public inquiry into the conduct of Finis Lavon, who served as Minister of Defense from 1954 to 1955. Lavon had been accused of authorizing a false flag operation to bomb various civilian targets in Egypt, but denied any knowledge and blamed Peres as the man responsible. After being forced to resign, Lavon sought to clear his name. When Ben-Gurion proposed a full judicial inquiry, Meir and most of the Mapai leaders protested, horrified at the prospect of a leadership struggle being played out in public. Ben-Gurion resigned from the premiership in June 1963 and was replaced by Levi Eshkol, but continued to call for a public investigation into the Lavon affair, attacking his successor in the process. Despite being in her mid-60s and having recently been diagnosed with lymphoma, Meir led the campaign to prevent Ben-Gurion from making a political comeback. When a dying Moshe Sharet attacked Ben-Gurion for undermining national unity in the Knesset in February 1965, Meir leaned over and kissed him before launching her own assault on the former Prime Minister. Ben-Gurion responded by forming a new party, Rafi, which won 10 seats in the Knesset elections in November. In the meantime, Meir had organized an alliance with the pro-Soviet incarnation of Adat HaVoida, which had split from Mapai in 1944, which won 45 seats in total, hammering the final nail into Ben-Gurion's political coffin. Following her political victory, Meir resigned as foreign minister in January 1966 and declared her intention to retire due to illness. She retained considerable political clout and within weeks was asked to serve as Secretary General of Mapai, a role she accepted in order to seek the unification of the moderate socialist parties into a single united Labour Party. Although Eshkol was Prime Minister in name, Meir was the most powerful political leader in the country. While the Israeli government attempted to recover from the destructive political struggles of the previous decade, tensions were increasing on the Egyptian-Israeli border. On the 16th of May 1967, in response to false Soviet intelligence of an imminent Israeli attack, Nasser requested the withdrawal of the UN peacekeeping force on the Egyptian-Israeli border, which had been in place since the Suez Crisis, intending to replace them with Egyptian soldiers. Eshkol's government struggled to deal with the crisis, while conservative opposition leader Menachem Begin joined forces with Dayan, calling for Ben-Gurion to lead a government of national unity. Eshkol and Meir resisted these moves, but were forced to acquiesce to a national unity government with Dayan as Minister of Defense. On the morning of the 5th of June, Dayan ordered the Israeli Air Force to take to the skies, and within a matter of hours, over 300 Egyptian planes were destroyed on the ground. Over the course of 6 days, Israeli troops reoccupied the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula and conquered the Golan Heights from Egypt's ally Syria, while East Jerusalem and the West Bank were seized from Jordan. This time, the Israelis were determined to resist UN calls to withdraw their occupation forces. Back in Israel, Meir continued her efforts to unite the moderate left, resulting in the creation of the Israeli Labour Party in January 1968, following the merger of Mapai, Rafi, and Adut. After serving as the first General Secretary of the United Party, Meyer stepped down in August 1968, seemingly intent on retiring for good. In order to undermine Dayan's ambitions to become Eshkol's successor, Meyer had installed former Adut leader Yigal Allon as Eshkol's deputy prime minister. With Allon and Dayan arguing in the background over what to do with the West Bank, Eshkol had a heart attack in late 1968 and died at the end of February 1969. Recognizing that the appointment of either Allon or Dayan as prime minister would risk a split in the party, Labour Secretary-General Pinhas Sapir invited Meyer to become the new prime minister. Recognizing her failing health, she accepted only after being assured by her doctor that she had another 10 years to live. Although both Dayan and Allon were far more popular among the people, on the 7th of March the Labour Party's Central Committee voted unanimously in favour of Meyer, who assumed the premiership on the 17th. 2 months shy of her 71st birthday, the woman who had been at Ben-Gurion's right hand in the 1950s before plotting his political downfall in the 1960s, had become the first female head of government in the Western world. The Israel Golda Meir inherited was a far cry from the socialist agrarian paradise she had dreamed about as a young girl in Milwaukee. Nevertheless, she could pride herself on her part in building a homeland for the Jewish people. However, it was one that remained under attack from hostile neighbors. In 1968, following the humiliating defeat in the Six-Day War, Nasser launched the War of Attrition by firing missiles from the western bank of the Suez Canal into Israeli-occupied Sinai. As Prime Minister, Meir inherited Eshkol's coalition, which spanned the political spectrum and created political deadlock. Thanks to her modesty and her down-to-earth style, by July her approval rating soared to 90%, and in October 1969 she led an alliance of Labour and the left-wing Mapam party, which won 56 seats in the Knesset. Despite her socialist leanings, she struggled to manage the labour disputes which embroiled the country. Although the Israeli economy would grow by 35% from 1969 to 1973, workers' wages did not keep up with inflation. While all the labour unions in the country were run by the state through Histadrut, Meir was unwilling to grant the Histadrut any degree of independence from the state, and the Labour Federation collapsed within a decade. Her fidelity to socialist concepts of collectivism undermined her support among the younger liberal individualist section of society. In March 1971, Meir faced a popular uprising in Jerusalem organized by the Black Panthers, an organization which took its name from the American civil rights group to protest against discrimination against Jews from North Africa and the Middle East who experienced a lower standard of living than those with Eastern European ancestry. The Panthers resented the fact that the Israeli government was dominated by Eastern European Jews, and Meir herself had once said that Jews who didn't speak Yiddish were not real Jews. While cracking down on the Panthers, Meir attempted to defend Eastern European Jews by claiming that they had faced more deprivation and discrimination than other Jews, and accused the Panthers of being unpatriotic. The demonstrations continued into the summer, during which the Panthers demanded Meir's resignation and burned her effigy. Despite her previous opposition to Ben-Gurion on the same issue, Meir now argued that defense spending was a priority and the government could not afford social improvements. In spite of the Israeli military's record of success, Meir was anxious about Israel's continued survival, especially after the Palestinian Liberation Organization's leader Yasser Arafat, who had assumed the place of the ailing Nasser as the leader of the Arab cause in 1970, announced that the Arabs sought the destruction of the State of Israel. Though Meir attempted to find a diplomatic solution with her Arab neighbors, they refused to open talks without the Israelis first withdrawing to their pre-1967 borders. Unsurprisingly, Meir refused to give up her bargaining chips before negotiations had even begun. Disillusioned by the UN peace process, the Americans and Soviets attempted to come up with a solution for the Middle East. Neither of the great powers wanted the Cold War to turn hot, and US President Richard Nixon was keen to improve relations with the Soviets. Meir believed that such peace initiatives could not achieve much, while the Arabs remained determined to wipe Israel off the world map. In December 1969, Nixon's Secretary of State William Rogers announced a peace plan based on Israeli withdrawal from all occupied territories in return for an Egyptian promise of non-belligerency. Meir objected to Rogers' vague proposals and instructed her ambassador to Washington to mobilize the American Jewish lobby against it. The Israeli refusal was accompanied by bombing raids into the Egyptian interior, leading the Soviets to increase their arms supplies to Egypt. At the end of July 1970, Meir reluctantly agreed to Rogers' offer of a 90-day ceasefire alongside UN mediation, but her trust in the Americans was undermined when Israeli intelligence discovered that NASA had used the ceasefire to move a Soviet anti-aircraft missile system into place on the western bank of the Suez Canal. When pressured to demonstrate greater flexibility, the Israeli Prime Minister routinely brought up the anxiety she experienced as a young child faced with the threat of pogroms in the Russian Empire, accusing the Americans in particular of sacrificing Jewish security for their diplomatic ends. As she took her defiant stand, she drew closer to her defense minister and erstwhile rival Moshe Dayan. The Prime Minister acknowledged her ignorance of military affairs and relied on advice from the popular general, while the defense minister respected the political abilities of Israel's matriarch. The death of Nasser in September 1970 raised hopes of a peace settlement with his successor Anwar Sadat. Although Sadat continued to insist on Israeli withdrawal from all the occupied territories, Meir offered a partial withdrawal from the eastern bank of the Suez Canal. Though Sadat's counter-offer was unacceptable, Meir sketched out a plan which would see Israel keep the Golan Heights, Jerusalem, and the Egyptian port of Sharm el-Sheikh on the southern tip of the Sinai, while Israeli troops would withdraw from the rest of the peninsula. The proposals prompted Menachem Begin to call a vote of no confidence against her, which she survived by the narrowest of margins. Meir's plans for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip were less well defined, but she was prepared to give up these territories to the Arabs, preferably Jordan, since she believed that Israel's security was best served with a Jewish majority state rather than incorporating more than 1 million Arabs from the occupied territories. Unwilling to upset the delicate political balance in the country before the Arabs were serious about negotiations, Meir maintained the status quo, leaving Dayan and the Ministry of Defense to govern the West Bank. Dayan favored the unorthodox solution of a permanent Israeli military presence in the West Bank while allowing the Arab areas to be administered by Jordan. Although opposed by most of his government colleagues, Dayan hoped that coexistence would lead to peace and began to implement his vision, building Jewish settlements in the West Bank and facilitating the movement of goods and people between Israel and Jordan. Despite joining the Egyptians in the 1967 war, the Jordanians remained Israel's best friend among the Arab states. The Israelis recognized that King Hussein had been under considerable pressure to demonstrate pan-Arab solidarity from fellow Arab leaders and his own Palestinian subjects. Hussein was also keen to avoid the fate of his grandfather King Abdullah, whom Meir had met on the eve of Israeli independence and who had been assassinated by a Palestinian terrorist in 1951. On the 6th of September 1970, Palestinian terrorists hijacked 4 commercial planes and landed them on Dawson's Field, a Jordanian airbase, calling for the release of Fedayeen prisoners. After releasing most of the hostages, the Palestinians kept the Jews in custody and blew up the empty planes on the 12th of September. Jordan descended into civil war on the 17th of September when Hussein ordered loyal troops to crush the Fedayeen in his capital of Amman, resulting in Syrian intervention on behalf of the Palestinians. After receiving a plea for help from Hussein, Meir ordered the Israeli Air Force to fly over the Syrian columns in a demonstration of force, which, combined with a successful Jordanian counterattack, halted the Syrian attack. A tentative peace was brokered between Jordan and Palestine by Nasser days before his death. As the stalemate in the Middle East continued, a host of parties offered to mediate a peace settlement, including a delegation of African leaders, Romania's communist dictator Nicolae Ceausescu, and Pope Paul VI. Meir had given up hope of any meaningful peace with the Arabs, and this belief was reinforced on the morning of the 5th of September 1972, when the Palestinian terrorist group Black September kidnapped 11 Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. With 2 Israelis already dead, the terrorists threatened to kill the rest unless Israel released over 200 Arab prisoners. The incident was the latest in a series of terrorist attacks against Israeli targets authorized by Arafat's Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. When the terrorists refused to accept a ransom payment from the West German authorities, German police launched a botched rescue mission which resulted in the deaths of all the Israelis, a German police officer, and 5 terrorists. In response, on the 15th of September, Meir authorized Mossad to launch an operation to hunt down the terrorists responsible for Munich. When Meir was criticized for depriving the Palestinians of the right to their own nation, she refused to acknowledge the existence of a separate Palestinian nation and argued that Palestinian Arabs were free to settle in any of the Arab states in the Middle East. In May 1973, after 4 years leading the country, Meir announced her intention to step aside from the premiership in October. Her approval ratings remained above 70%, the economy was growing rapidly, and Israel was receiving generous military aid from the US government, which allowed her to feel increasingly secure. While Meir was turning her attention away from defense and towards social policy, in August, the Syrians installed Soviet anti-aircraft batteries opposite the Golan Heights. On the 25th of September, King Hussein secretly visited Israel to warn of an imminent Syrian attack supported by Egypt. Despite Israeli intelligence reports that Egyptian forces were advancing towards the Suez Canal, Dayan believed that the Egyptians would not dare to challenge the Israeli military. On the 5th of October, the Israeli Defense Forces Chief of Staff, General David Al-Azhar, suspected that hostilities were imminent, but the Israeli leadership refrained from full-scale mobilization. On the morning of the 6th of October, the day of Yom Kippur, the most important holiday on the Jewish religious calendar, Meir met with Al-Azhar and Dayan. Although she decided against launching a preemptive airstrike, which would jeopardize American diplomatic support, she agreed to full mobilization over Dayan's objections. The invasion began that afternoon, but the Israeli leadership was confident that they would repeat their previous successes against the Arabs. They were surprised to hear reports of Egyptians launching coordinated strikes on Israeli targets along the canal in the south, while Syrian tanks rolled towards the Golan Heights. The Israeli air superiority, which had won the Six-Day War, was nullified by the Egyptian and Syrian anti-aircraft systems. While a panicked Dayan proposed giving up the Golan for a more defensible position, Elazar remained optimistic that he could hold off the enemy attacks long enough to mobilize his reserves. When a disheartened Dayan offered his resignation, Meir refused, but took personal charge of the war effort, developing plans for a counter-offensive alongside her senior officers. As the Israeli reserves took to the field, the tide of war began to turn at the cost of heavy casualties. By the third day of the war, the Syrians were falling back in the north, while Al-Azhar's costly counterattack in the south halted the Egyptian advance. After recapturing the Golan Heights, Meir authorized the Israeli Defense Force to advance on the Syrian capital of Damascus on the 11th of October. On the 14th of October, Israeli tanks defeated an Egyptian attack in the Sinai, allowing Israeli troops to cross over the canal on the 15th. When the Soviets and Americans proposed a ceasefire and direct negotiations between Egypt and Israel, Meir was initially inclined to reject the terms, since the Israeli Defense Force was poised to surround and eliminate the Egyptian Third Army on the Sinai. After learning that Sadat had accepted the proposals, Meir met U.S. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger to finalize the details of a ceasefire on the 22nd of October. After an Egyptian attempt to break out of the encirclement, fighting resumed until a second ceasefire was agreed on the 25th of October, with the Egyptian Third Army completely trapped. While the Israelis had managed to pull off a victory, 2,600 soldiers had perished in the process, and rather than celebrating, the Israeli people blamed the initial setbacks on Meir and Dayan. Though she acknowledged her responsibility for the debacle, Meir went to America to discuss peace proposals with Kissinger and Nixon. In late-night discussions with Kissinger, Meir adamantly refused to break the encirclement of the Third Army without a prisoner exchange. In the meantime, on the 28th of October, Egyptian and Israeli army officers made good progress in negotiating a prisoner exchange and the resupply of the Egyptian Third Army, as well as the gradual withdrawal of troops from both sides and the reopening of the Suez Canal. The agreement was finalized when Kissinger visited the Middle East the following week. As a result of the war, the Knesset elections scheduled for the 31st of October had been postponed to the 31st of December. Despite her previous commitment to resign, Meir hoped to hold the Labour Party together while denying power to Begin's Likud party. While Dayan had been blamed for the failure to prepare for the war, Meir kept her defence minister in his post, causing her own popularity to decline. On the 21st of December, Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban attended the Middle East Peace Conference in Geneva alongside the Jordanian and Egyptian delegations, but the meeting lasted one day without being reconvened. When voters went to the polls on the 31st, Meir's Labour won 40% of the vote against 29% for Likud. While Labour remained the largest party, Meir was disappointed that she had lost support. As she attempted to cobble together a new government, Meir realized that whether she retained Dayan or sacked him, a faction of the Labour Party would refuse to support the government. On the 11th of April, she resigned as party leader, throwing her support behind Yitzhak Rabin, who narrowly emerged as the party's choice. Meir retained the premiership until she was able to secure a disengagement agreement with Syria, brokered by Kissinger on the 31st of May. On the 3rd of June, she left the Prime Minister's office and was succeeded by Rabin. At the age of 76, Golda Meir was a legend in her own lifetime. When her ghost-written autobiography was published in 1975, it became a global bestseller. On the 14th of November 1977, Meyer attended the opening of Golda, a Broadway play by William Gibson, only to be thoroughly disappointed by Anne Bancroft's performance in the title role. Days later, she returned to Israel to meet Anwar Sadat, who was visiting Israel after declaring his willingness to make peace. When Meyer asked the Egyptian president why he could not have met her several years earlier, Sadat replied that the time was not right. Earlier in the year, Menachem Begin had become prime minister after defeating Labour in the Knesset elections in May. Meyer was disappointed that the conservative Begin, who appointed the rehabilitated Dayan as his foreign minister, was taking the credit for making peace. In September 1978, Begin, Sadat and US President Jimmy Carter negotiated the Camp David Accords, paving the way for Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories. While Begin and Sadat were in Oslo to receive the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize, Golda Meir died of lymphoma at the age of 80 on the 8th of December 1978. Golda Meir had lived an extraordinary life spanning 3 continents. After being born into poverty in the Russian Empire, with the threat of pogroms hanging over her, she spent her formative years in the United States, where she became a passionate believer in the Labour Zionist movement. After struggling to balance her life ambitions with her parents' demands, she prevailed upon her reluctant husband to move to Palestine, anticipating the establishment of a Jewish state following the Balfour Declaration. After a difficult first decade in the kibbutz and struggling to make ends meet in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, Meir began her gradual climb up the ranks of the Jewish political leadership, becoming an invaluable advocate for the Zionist movement in the United States, neglecting her children and leaving her husband in the process. After working tirelessly to assist European Jews who fell under Nazi occupation in the 1930s and 40s, Meir emerged as the right-hand woman of David Ben-Gurion, the father of the State of Israel, founded in 1948. When Israel survived the Arab invasion that year, Meir was instrumental in raising funds to enable the Israeli military to continue the resistance. As Minister of Labour in the early 1950s, she championed ambitious housing, construction and social welfare programs before being appointed Foreign Minister on the eve of the Suez Crisis. Serving almost a decade as Foreign Minister, she helped to continue the flow of military aid from the United States while strengthening relations with African states. After toppling Ben-Gurion in the mid-1960s, Meir united the Labour movement and wielded power behind the scenes during the Six-Day War in 1967, before her appointment as Prime Minister in 1969 following Levi Eshkol's death. Though Meir spent much of her premiership seeking a peace agreement with Nasser and his successor Sadat, she was caught off guard by the Yom Kippur War in 1973 and struggled to manage its consequences despite successfully organizing successful counteroffensives against Egypt and Syria. It was only during the final months of her life in 1978 that her rivals, Begin and Sadat, made a significant step in the Middle East peace process. However, the issue remains unresolved still in the 21st century. What do you think of Golda Meir? Was she a formidable leader who demonstrated to the world that women could stand up to men on the international political stage and ensured the continued survival of the State of Israel? Or did she miss several opportunities to make peace with the Arabs as a result of her intransigence and lack of flexibility? Please, let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, Thank you very much for watching.